Dear listeners, welcome to episode 5 of Thinking Psychologist. In all these four episodes, you saw that we have spoken to a couple of the top psychologists across the globe, including three of them coming from USA itself. One of them is speaking about the state of flow. Second one talking about how our mind deceives us in every state. And the third person that we spoke to us about how to achieve the state of flow really fast. Then we went across to all the way across all the continents and we reached Hong Kong to speak to a clinical psychologist who was talking about what does liberation and nirvana feels like. And further up, we spoke to a designer who in Reading, UK, who spoke to us about there's nothing like rational decision making, and our emotion drive all the decisions. It's like a big elephant that our emotion is, and our rational mind is just a small pilot sitting on top of that elephant. And it's hard to drive the elephant everywhere unless until you train your mind. With that said, and if something has brought you to episode 5, you would already know that this podcast series is adding value to your life as well as you like the discussions here. Continuing the series here, we have a really interesting discussion planned today. Today with us is Michelle Diamond, who is the author of Darwin's Apple, the Evolutionary Biology of Religion book. Michelle comes from United States and brings in a lot of experience in terms of psychology, religion, atheism, as well as understanding the human mind in terms of consciousness. So, without further ado, I welcome Michelle to the show, and hey, hi, Mish, welcome to the show, and
Thank you, Ash. Thanks for inviting me.
my audience would really like to know something about your journey, your life, and a little bit of introduction, please.
Sure. Well, my journey is a little bit unusual. I did get a degree, a bachelor's degree in biology, and then I ended up going into the business world or work world instead of going for my postgraduate degrees. But I always had this interest in psychology and human behavior and human evolution. And I had that as a teenager when I first read the book, The Naked Ape by Desmond Morris, which turned me on to the idea that humans were animals first and foremost, which was fairly, even though it's not seemingly that unusual, it struck me as being a very different point of view at the time. So when I went to college, that was the direction I was going, was to study human biology and human psychology, even though I was strictly a biology major. And I ended up mostly working in the field of pharmacology and medical devices as a technical writer. So that was my career. But in the meantime, I kept up this avocation of interest in human psychology and human evolution. And along the way, I figured it came to me that one of the most unusual gaps in knowledge about humanity was religion. That there was no good answer as to why humans had religion. And so I thought I would look into this, and I did, and I came up with some ideas, and that's what ended up going into the book. But it also informed me a lot about things like consciousness as well. And so all this research that I did, which was pretty extensive, has led me to this point.
Superb. Thanks for that brief intro, Mitch. Looks like your early years of entering into the psychology field is very much what I am doing now, because I am also in my work life and slowly getting into psychology, and it's really interesting to have you, and thank you for coming to the show. Now, starting with the discussion, Mitch, and I want to start with a question. I want to start with the question is that since you have studied the human psychology, what can you tell us about the thoughts that enter our mind and how do they govern our consciousness and our daily life, and how does it impact our behavior? What are your thoughts about this?
Well, first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a quote from V.S. Ramachandran, who is a neuroscientist who works in San Diego, California. And he wrote a book called A Short History of Consciousness, or a brief history of consciousness. And on the very first page, he says, your conscious life, in short, is nothing but an elaborate post hoc rationalization of things you really do for other reasons. So he's saying that our consciousness is sort of a rationalization, something that comes after we do, we act, we think. But that thinking is, as you've talked about on your podcast several times, it's unconscious mostly. And so when things reach consciousness, it's like a reporter. It's like if you're watching sports on TV and the announcer is telling you what's happening, you already know what's happening. You've seen it already, and he's just repeating it to you. And that's what consciousness is. So when we live our life, when we have our day-to-day existence, and we have consciousness, it's telling us what's going on. We already know what's going on. You don't need consciousness, absolutely, but it helps a lot. It comes in and says, it sort of is like feedback. It says, I'm confirming or I'm telling you what I think is going on at the same time as you're having these unconscious experiences.
So are you hinting towards the inner voice that we have in our head? Is it same as consciousness? Is that the one you are hinting towards?
Well, consciousness is difficult to define. Certainly, there's a lot of people who have been working on that, guys like Ned Block and um, Crick, Francis Crick, the late Francis Crick, and lots of different people, and they all come up with various ways of interpreting it. I know you've talked about Antonio Damasio in past podcasts, and he has his own ideas of consciousness. One of the ones I like the best is by Gerald Edelman, a neuroscientist who won the Nobel Prize for his work. And he talks about it at a neuronal level. He talks about these reentrant pathways that go between the frontal cortex and the thalamus. And we don't need to get into these kinds of detail. What he's saying is that there's this repeating kinds of signals going back and forth. And he believes that the repetition of these signals between the frontal cortex and the thalamus deeper in the brain creates these states, what we call consciousness, the ways of holding on to concepts, ideas, thinking. It creates in a kind of, shall we say, temporary permanence of concepts that we can hold on to and then play with in our brains, in our minds. So for me, that's the way I like to think about it. Mm-hmm. It helps me to visualize a way to say, what is consciousness and what's it really doing? You've talked about the monkey mind in the past, how we have thoughts and they go around and around, and sometimes these thoughts can be a problem. They're noise. They manifest in different ways in different people, but we hear this inner voice that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so that's one way that we can talk about it, but there's other ways we can talk about it as well. So yes, the inner voice is one of those things that is identified as as how we represent consciousness when we talk about it.
Okay. No, I totally understand, because everyone and everything that I've been reading as well online, everyone has been saying that it's really difficult to tell you what consciousness is everyone owns personal experience what the consciousness is all about. So, Mitch, coming towards the consciousness, and if we just take the example of inner voice as one particular, aspect of the consciousness, mindfulness meditation practices have enabled people to calm their mind. And when the calmness happen and there is a silence in your head, in a sort of the way the noise that's happening in your head also dies down and slows down. Does it have an impact on our consciousness?
Well, I would say that is impacting the consciousness. When you say it's quieting the inner voice, that is quieting consciousness. Absolutely. And actually, for me, a very big point, it's a big idea, that we want to do that there's a goal among people, and meditation is one of the big ways that people do that, where they quiet that inner voice. They're actually quieting their consciousness. That's right. I agree.
In one of your posts that I read, and in which you were saying that mindfulness, meditation, yoga, and everything is much hyped about as of now, but the reality is a little bit different in somewhat way. Can you shed some more light on that topic?
You're saying it's hyped. Can you elaborate what that means?
So, we see a sort of a mindfulness revolution that's happening in the Western world now. In terms of, we see, the gurus coming up and telling you that mindfulness is a way to, transform your mind, transform your brain, and then people adapting to yoga and not really knowing which aspect, which direction this is going. And a couple of interactions and the reading that I have done, if this meditation aspect per se is not handled carefully, it also leads to a lot of trouble, where the calmness also of the mind can lead to the zombification of the person as well, where your emotions die down and then you react to the world changes.
It's well. Let's back up a bit. First of all, where did meditation and yoga come from? And of course, they came from what 2,500, 3,000 years ago in India, or Southern Asia, right? And the Buddha is presumably maybe the first or one of the earliest people, or at least the one who got some attention that was recorded in some of the documents in the uh, well, I'm not an expert in Hindu religion or philosophy, so I don't want to speak inappropriately. But um, the fact is, these practices have been going on for a very long time. And certainly what yoga and meditation are in the Western world is very different than what it was and is presumably still in for Hindu and Buddhism, where I know yoga is it's very deeply spiritual, and there's a lot of aspects to yoga, different yogic practices, and they are there's a lot more going on there than simply doing these stretches and breathing exercises. Now, that's very religious in its origins, and of course, as you point out, it's come to the United States and other Western countries, and it's been stripped for the most part that spirituality. And now it's, yes, you simply go and you do the stretches and you do and concentrate on your breathing, but it still does at least a part of what it's intended to do, which is to quiet the consciousness, quiet the busy monkey mind. And by the way, I think when we call it monkey mind, it's an insult to monkeys, but since that's the common phrase for it, we'll continue to use it, even though I think I'm not really convinced that the monkeys have that kind of mind. It's really the human mind that is very busy and kind of overactive. But in any case, so what it tells me is that humans have this desire in general to alter their consciousness. Now, in the case of meditation and yoga, you're trying to quiet it, calm it. We can eventually talk about some of the other aspects of spirituality, which are a bit different than yoga and meditation. But certainly in this case, yes, you're trying to quiet the mind. Now, as far as does it have negative consequences because people aren't actually practicing it necessarily according to its origins, to its spiritual origins? It's hard to know. My feeling is that if people can find something that they feel makes their life better, that if they can quiet their minds, that if they feel their minds are too busy, too noisy, that it's interfering with their ability to live a good full life, then it's a good thing. It's better than not. It's always possible, and certainly we know it happens, that charlatans take advantage of people, and they might do it through these religious practices, and there's certainly instances of so-called gurus who have come to the United States and created sects or cults, and some of those cults have been turned out to be rather problematic and not good for the people. But it didn't mean that it had to be an Indian guru. I mean, obviously there's cases of people who do this from all backgrounds, and sometimes they're religious and sometimes they're not. You have famous Jim Jones, who led his people to mass suicide in Guyana, 25 years ago. Have Scientology, which I think is quite a big problem. And so, Scientology is a very pseudo-religious kind of thing, and but people are always susceptible to others who want to take advantage of them, and oftentimes it's political, and we're certainly experiencing constant political problems with people with would-be dictators who would like to take over and be well, we don't want to get political, but it happens to people at all levels, and so it can be a potential problem through spirituality and through meditation and yoga. But I think the overall benefit is clearly there, and we need to promote that as a means for people who need to quiet their minds.
Now, Mitch, once, another aspect that, I've been thinking about as well. It's when it comes to quieting down the mind, you know, does quieting down the mind means that we would be really in control of our mind? Will it be us taking those decisions? Because, we have seen in what happens in these split brain experiments, the one half doesn't know the other half. And so the fundamental question arises that uh, is there a hidden personality or a hidden person sitting inside our head who is just sort of giving us false direction and making us feel that we are in control, or is it something bigger than that?
There's two things here. One is, yes, there's a hidden person inside us. No, it's not giving us false information. It's giving us our information. So who are we? We are an unconscious being who has this thing called consciousness. Another way of looking at it is self-awareness, is another aspect that people like to use to identify consciousness. So a very small amount of what goes on in us reaches awareness, consciousness. And we can say, oh, I know I know something that happened. But most of what goes on, we're not aware of inside of us. But it's not false. Part of the problem is that people want to believe that they should be a certain way, that they should achieve certain things, they should have certain moral characters. There's all kinds of goals that people set for themselves. And so then they judge themselves against that goal. And so if they aren't doing something towards that goal, then they're bad, or they're doing something wrong, or they're false, or whatever. That's kind of a different problem. We are who we are. We can be different. There's ways that we can work towards improving ourselves if that is our goal. And certainly meditation, I think, is one of those ways. But at a certain point, we are overthinking, and part of our consciousness, it's really in our consciousness to a degree that is saying what we should be, what is our goal. As animals, first, at another level, if we're looking at it at the level of animals, our only goal is to be evolutionarily successful. And all that means is we reproduce and have offspring that are fertile themselves. That's the most basic biological way of thinking. Now, we don't like to think that way as humans because we have consciousness and higher thoughts and goals and ideals and all these other things want to think that we're animals, or we don't want to think that we have to behave like animals, that we can behave at a higher level. Well, that's a whole philosophical discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to say that we are still animals. We still, for the most part, act in ways that are evolutionarily beneficial to ourselves. We want to survive. We want to do the things that are necessary. Most people want to reproduce. People are now able to not to do so, and more people are saying, I don't want to have children. That's a conscious decision. Okay. But most people are not like that. Most people still want to have children. And even those who don't want to have children, they act biologically, which is that they want to have sex. And now they at least can control whether the children are the result of that, but they're still acting biologically. So part of the problem is, just to sort of return to where we started, the idea of having false ideas is difficult because it's assuming a judgment. It's assuming that there's something out there that says what is right and wrong, what is true and false. That's philosophical. That's a different issue. And again, we can talk philosophically, but that's not really what we're talking about today. So uh, people do things that comes from their unconscious, which are ultimately tied to genetics, the parts of genetics that drive our behavior. Obviously, a lot of our behavior is not driven directly by genetics, and that's one of the key traits that humans have different from most other animals, is that we're not tied to our instincts like most other animals. Nevertheless, we are still mostly animals. Well, we are animals 100%, but our big mind, our big brains give us some opportunities and freedom to act other than what you might say animals would normally do 100%. Answered the
I was
question.
yeah. Yes, very much. Thanks, Mesh. I was recently, just to add to another point here. I was recently reading through one of the texts, and where the topic of evolution came. So we as human beings have been living in jungle, and our natural selection, our consciousness has been developed to be always aware of what threats are going to attack us. So we are always constantly aware, and we tend to exaggerate the problem which we perceive is going to come. Now that the society has evolved, rather than living in small villages inside the jungle, we are living in big cities. But still, once the human perceive a threat, I believe the level of perception of that threat is still that high. And that actually causes the anxiety, the stress that is very prevalent. What are your thoughts on that?
That's right. Anxiety is one of the things, just like depression. It's one of these characteristics that we identify as being perhaps due to our consciousness, and that, do we really perceive threat accurately? And there's a
Hmm.
lot of evidence, a lot of scientific studies have been done to show that we don't perceive threat very accurately. Sometimes there really is threat, sometimes there's not. A good example is people who have fear of flying. So the statistics show that flying is much more safe than driving, at least probably in countries where there's a lot of people in a big city. But of course they have a fear of flying, and I can understand that. I mean, you're up in the air and you feel like, well, you know, if the plane has a problem, you're going to die. It's going to fall out of the sky. But the reality is not there. So that's just one example of how people misperceive actual threat. Uh, Another aspect of that is that humans have cognitive biases. This is well under, and you can Wikipedia, for example, and it'll show you a list of about 200 different cognitive biases that have been identified by psychologists. And so, what's my point? Kind of lost my train of thought there. Oh, well, it's just that so one of the biases is called representativeness, which is a fancy way of saying uh, it's prejudice, it's
Mm,
xenophobia. So turns out that even in a very integrated society, like theoretically like the United States, where you have a lot of different cultures who've come from all over the world, people still have unconscious bias and fear of the strangers, of the others, of people who don't look like themselves. And this has been well shown again in various studies, so that we, at least a lot of Americans, try their hardest to be non-judgmental and to at least accept people who don't look like themselves and might have other cultural backgrounds. And yet, even those people can be shown in experiments to have implicit bias, that they have an unconscious reaction to people who don't look like themselves or who dress differently or somehow they can't identify with in some obvious way. And it's also part of the fact that when we look at people, we have immediate first impressions unconsciously. We immediately make judgments about people. It's just our nature. People do this. Now, at the same time, this can cause a lot of thoughts, anxieties, fears unconsciously. It's a difficult problem. This is how people are. This is something that they evolved.
mm,
So uh, there's a lot of ways that people are unable to, or makes it more of a challenge for people to deal with these unconscious attitudes, uh, expectations. And so you talk about people in cities having higher anxieties. Well, it's not necessarily just in cities. It can be anywhere and everywhere. It's perhaps the case that they run into other people who look different than themselves a lot more, and maybe that has something to do with it. But there's
yeah.
all kinds of ways that people have anxiety. Another way that's one of my favorites is freedom of choice. So
Mhm.
in our modern societies, we are given all kinds of consumer choices. There's 100 different TVs that we can choose from. There's hundreds of different cars and different whatever we want. And you can go on the internet and there's 100 more of whatever you're looking for. How do you make choices? And so one of my favorite studies is by Sheena Iyengar, who wrote The Art of Choosing. She was she did this famous study about the jam jar choices. Do you know that one?
No, no, no.
So so they on one Saturday on the weekend they went into a grocery store with permission and set up a table, and they put out six different flavors of jam, and they offered the people the opportunity to taste any of them or all of them. And then after that, they gave a coupon to the person, and then the coupon would be given at the cashier, and then they would know if the person bought something. The next weekend, they came in and they put out 24 different jam flavors and said, you can taste any or all of them. And then they gave the person a coupon to buy the jam. The question is, which day did the people buy more jam, the six jam choices or the 24 jam choices?
Mm,
It was the six jam choices. People significantly bought more of the jam.
uh,
So the point is, too many choices have a disincentivizing effect on people. It overwhelms their poor brains because we really don't have all the cognitive ability to make these kinds of choices. People are overwhelmed by all the opportunities that are out there. People want someone to kind of give them direction. They want limited choices because they don't have the cognitive skills to deal with it. Too much information. We're overloaded.
yeah.
Another aspect of anxiety. So there's all these different ways that we deal with the various kinds of assaults to our consciousness.
Do you,
And
yeah,
so this is why people need to continue to look for ways to deal with it, to quiet it.
write it down. Yeah. So, in your book, The Darwin's Apple and the Evolution, so some of the aspects that you spoke about, are you covering that in the book as well? What are
Oh,
what all
absolutely.
other what all other aspects does your book cover? What makes it interesting for our listeners to go ahead and pick up the book from Amazon?
So for the first, well, from chapters, the first chapter is kind of an introduction, an overall look of what you're going to get. But in the second through fourth chapters, it really is about consciousness. And I talk about the split brain, and I talk about choosing, and I talk about, well, eventually by when you get to chapter 4, this is where it really talks about the problem of consciousness. So we've been talking about, and you've talked to your other guests on your podcasts about the problems of consciousness, about the monkey mind. What I find is that people are aware, they're they understand, a lot of people understand that the human brain is busy and noisy, and we have biases, and we have anxieties and depression. But what I don't hear people saying is that there is a real issue here. The evolution of the human brain is this wonderful experiment where you have consciousness, which actually does help people do wonderful things and create this wonderful civilization and technologies and make our lives better in so many ways. And at the same time, consciousness has downsides, it has drawbacks. These problems that we've been talking about, these are endemic to humanity, and it's a problem. So I talk about that in the first, well, the second through fourth chapters, the problems of consciousness. And I say that an endemic issue for humanity.
Mhm.
Then I flip over and I say, well, I've already introduced the idea of how this ties to religion. For me, religion for the individual, not religion of the gods and the church and the hierarchy. It's just that the inner experience of religion for people, the purpose of it is to quiet the conscious mind, but not always quiet it. It's to alter consciousness.
Mhm.
Quieting, calming consciousness is one of the ways that religion does that, but it does it in a lot of other ways as well. We can talk about that too. And so and the other thing that religion does a lot is that it brings up emotions. So emotions are the biological features that historically in animals drive their behavior, or at least are very important in driving their behavior. And emotions are based on genetically derived systems in the body between the nervous system and the endocrine system, mostly, but the whole body is is engaged in emotional activity. And so religion, by and large, religious behavior engenders emotions as it also alters consciousness. So that's the basic idea of the book. So then I talk about rituals and I talk about emotions, but mostly rituals after I talk about consciousness, because rituals are the behaviors of religion.
Mhm.
And behaviors are things that you can study biologically. Whereas most people like to think of religion in terms of beliefs. Beliefs, certainly, beliefs are important to religion, but people have beliefs about a lot of stuff. They have scientific beliefs, even. They have social beliefs. They have political beliefs. They have beliefs about all kinds of stuff. So belief is something that is a lot greater than just religion. And when you talk, most people talk about religious belief, they're not talking about what belief, the function of belief is in humans. So they've sort of skipped over a lot of stuff. So belief for me is something that is secondary. Sure, it's part of religion, but if we want to understand the basics of religion, first we have to look at behavior and evolution. And so then I look at what are the behaviors of of ritual, of religious behavior? Well, I end up talking about there's a lot of things like rites of passage and sacrifice and all kinds of stuff. But rites of passage means a lot of different things, and sacrifice can be a lot of different things depending on what culture you come from. But I like to think that there are certain universal rituals that people engage in for religious behaviors. And the ones I list are music, dance, mythology, prayer, and art. And those are the
Mm-hmm.
ones I focus on. There, as I said, there's others, but those are the ones that when you see them, you pretty much know that's what it is. When someone makes music, you can identify it. Whereas a lot of other kinds of ritual behaviors, well, a lot of the ritual behaviors use all these different aspects in various combinations. So one example is the mask dance of Bali, the island in the South Pacific. And they actually make masks, which are art, and they dance and they sing and they tell a story of their ancestors. So they're pretty much combining everything. Um, so and that's the pretty much the third of the book. The last third of the book is going through these different ritual behaviors and talking about how they're beneficial. Certainly music is well known to engage in the emotional systems. It's probably the best studied in that way. But they also find that in hospital settings, playing music to patients, say post-operatively, helps them require less painkillers, helps them recover faster. And and dance is known to help people, say, who have Parkinson's disease, where their motor control is compromised. They engage in dance therapy, and they can actually have periods where their symptoms are reduced, their shaking symptoms are reduced. So they all, and by the way, there are therapies. There is art therapy. There is an organization in the United States that promotes art therapy, and there's music therapy and dance therapy. All these therapies exist. So there's just coincidentally, it turns
Mm-hmm.
out, all these ways that these kinds of ritual behaviors, what were once considered ritual behaviors and still are, they've been utilized in different ways, but have the purpose of helping people heal or deal with various kinds of problems that they have. So that's kind of the structure of the book.
Ah, okay. And what would be the one key takeaway for the readers of your book?
One, well, the basic idea is that religion is genetically has genetic a genetic basis. We have genetic predispositions to have religious practices, and what that means is we have genetic basis to engage in religious like rituals. These things that we do now, listening to music or going to a dance, they don't have the same kind of religious connotation that they did when they first evolved. Just like yoga and meditation in the United States do not have the same kind of spiritual basis that they evolved originally, but they still do the same function that they did originally, which is to alter consciousness.
Understood.
So
Clear.
did I give you one idea? I might have given you a few ideas, but I
Yes,
think it
you
was the
have.
basic idea.
What in a nutshell, what I got was is so the whole sequence of uh, thoughts, emotions, and then the behavior. And in a way, you're saying is that the driven behavior and the emotions, if you take a step back, there are the beliefs. The religious beliefs are the ones who are driving that emotion and which are leading to the action that an individual would take. And that's how it has
What I would
evolved.
rather what I would rather say is it's the religious behaviors that
Hmm.
drive it, that drive the emotions.
The emotion.
It's if we think about where religion evolved in hunter-gatherers tens of thousands of years ago, rituals did they have? Well, the way we think about it is anthropologists studied these the existing hunter-gatherers from 100 years ago or 150 years ago. They kind of don't exist in a pure form much anymore, but at least we have those observations, and we saw them dancing. They had various kinds of dances for different kinds of ritual purposes, whether it was to ask for rain and for the crops to be strong, or for strength in war, if that was what was necessary, or as part of the rites of passage for the young men and women. They danced and they made music and they chanted and they had mythologies. And so where the stories come in, where the beliefs come in, is through the mythologies. And I talk about the mythologies, but again, if the mythology is a means to get people to change their consciousness. When you hear a story, when you watch a movie, when you read a book, you're transported away from your normal consciousness.
Yeah.
Now, of course,
I
some
believe
people.
mythology is all storytelling that you are mentioning, because we as a humans only understand stories, and once the religious preachings are told in a way of the stories, it becomes a completely different ball game altogether, and people get it really
Right.
fast.
So there's one study that I have in my book, and I talk about actually in the articles online that you saw. Um, they did a survey of people and said, "Tell us about your religious beliefs," and then people would write it down. Then they would present these people with a story that was, well, a story. Let's call it like the Ramayana, which is very different than saying, "This is our doctrine. This is, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and this is, what the laws, what the rules of religion are." Very different aspects, very different ways of presenting religious ideas. And then they would ask people about their religious feelings and beliefs after that. And what they found was that people have very different religious ideas depending on how you present the information to them. So their understanding of religion, when you tell them a story, is very different than their understanding of religion when you tell them the doctrine, when you tell them the rules and the laws. And what these researchers felt and said is that there can be contradictory, their religious beliefs. They're inconsistent. They don't really understand, and people would admit that they don't necessarily understand their religion very well. So the whole belief thing, that's one of the reasons why I don't really focus on beliefs per se, is because they don't even understand their own beliefs most of the time. And then, in fact, people argue about their beliefs in any case. You have one sect over here and one sect of Christians over there, and they're arguing about these minuscule things. They all believe in Jesus as their savior, but
Yeah.
was Mary sacred, or was Mary, what was her role, and is she incorporated into the ritual, and argue about all kinds of stuff. So people believe everything. It doesn't really tell you anything of value, only that they have belief, and that's
Right.
when I talk about.
Super, Mitch. I think we are running short of time as well, as we already know that the human listening span and the attention span is slowly decreasing. So,
Sure.
I generally try to stay, till 45 minutes if it really catches the audience attention. Anything above that, I don't think so. No one is going to listen to the rest of the show as long as it's, with that, I would like to conclude this discussion of this episode 5 of the podcast uh, with couple of things that I have been doing as well in my daily life about practicing mindfulness meditation on a daily basis. And what I have found is that the slowing down of the mind and looking at the thoughts very clearly, and then sort of attaining that wisdom where I'm able to filter the thoughts and only take the positive ones in, is actually creating a lot of difference in my personal life. And hopefully I will urge all my listeners to strongly practice meditation and change their lives as well. So in today's discussion, we got Mish to be talking about what consciousness is all about, and what his book says about the human evolution, and how stress and anxiety and our ability to perceive the threat is largely faulted. With that, we'll take closing remarks from Mitch and say goodbye to each other.
Well, I appreciate you having me.
Uh, First up, I would like to, you know, apologize from my behalf because of these miscommunications and me getting busy couple of times and we not being able to sync up. And and secondly, I'd like to really thank you for coming to the show and talking to me and taking some time out and speaking about some thoughts of you and what brain is all about. And I read through some of your work, found it really interesting, and that's where I reached out to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be able to talk to you.
Great, superb. Thanks, Mitch. Thanks. So, Mitch, just to give you a little bit of a formal introduction of mine before we go into the show, I am a mechanical engineer by the background, and I've been working with different organizations across the globe. So, I was studying in Australia for about 5 years, and then I was working with a different organization there in Sydney, and post that I returned back to India, my hometown, and I was working with startups, and then about 5 years working with Bosch, and developing new products. What got me interested into psychology was the topics of the brain and mind, and I picked up a couple of courses from Princeton University, and I thought it's really good idea to explore it further. And I have picked up formal psychology education as well, so those things are working in parallel for me. So and
Okay.
that's when I thought, going out and talking to a lot of different people out there who are working in this field, have knowledge and experience in that field, and then translate that knowledge across to my audience base, which is mostly working professionals and college students, is a good idea to improve my knowledge as well as further build upon my customer base. So that's my motivation of speaking to you.
All right. Sounds good. I'm a big fan of the Ramayana. I
Ah,
haven't listened to it for a long time. It was about
hmm.
20 years ago when I actually listened to it as a book on tape. So it was probably not the actual text, but it was an interpretation. It was someone retelling the story in a way that was easy to understand. But that was great, and I'm a big fan of Hahnemann in particular.
Super. Just to give you an idea, Mitch, here, I am born and brought up in the holy city of Ayodhya.
Yeah, I know. I saw in your somewhere in one of your bios
Yes.
around your podcast that was the case, or maybe it was
Yes.
LinkedIn. And so that's pretty cool.
Superb. I'm glad that the religion has spread its wings to such a such great dimensions. But I see, Mitch, you speaking a lot about in the atheist forums as well. How does that work out?
Well, you did a great search there, didn't you? um, well, I actually am involved in my local atheist group. I'm a regular participant, and I have some friends there. So it's just fun because, like any group of people, even when they call themselves atheists, there's a wide range of interests and beliefs. Some of them, so I've presented my my ideas about consciousness and religion in my book to the groups, to that group and other groups, as you've seen, I guess. And there's always a wide range of response. Some people are they whether or not they accept it is hard to say, but they're open to it, and other people are not open to it, and they it challenges their beliefs. And so it's a great thing because atheists like to think of themselves as rational people. But when presented with evidence, scientific evidence that suggests that their beliefs are not necessarily completely accurate, they can get emotional and they can get resistant, and they can tie into their confirmation bias, their desire to believe in their own beliefs, and reject things that doesn't align with their beliefs. So they're acting like people,
Mhm.
which is to be expected, but not necessarily in a completely rational way, which they like to pride themselves on.
Mhm. So, would you call yourself a religious person or a non-believer?
I'm a non-believer, but
Ah.
I'm one of the I don't know how rare I am, but I'm a non-believer who embraces people's religion. I think it's great that people have religion.
Mhm.
My interest in atheism, well, there's different interests, but one of them is that, of course, here in the United States, and I don't know how it is in India, the United States has the First Amendment, which says that, well, it says that uh, government religion, and that people should be free to practice their religion or not, as they see fit. And then there are people in the United States, and again, I don't know how much you know about this, because it is a Christian country in general. Um, there are a lot of Christians who would like to make the United States have a national religion, which would be Christianity, and to force us to embrace Christian doctrine and to change the laws to align with Christian doctrine. That bothers me a lot, and that's pretty universal among the atheists. That we all agree that that's a bad thing. So
Right.
uh, that's my my biggest thing about being an atheist. But as long as people uh, practice their religion for themselves and don't try and force it on anybody else, I'm completely supportive of that. And a lot of atheists that I know would like to think that religion is going away, and they're completely wrong. But you can only tell them so much before they, get kind of unhappy with you.
We, I would really like to take this recording into the podcast as well. So, the belief system that you spoke about, we're going to come back to that belief system.